Here we go. It's the snow day makeup. The last couple details on China, things that we just couldn't quite get to. Just a few little things here. So you're going to start with your Unit 4, Part 6 notes, and we're going to talk about environmental issues in China. Of course, there are a lot of them. What are the major challenges China faces? If you were to be asked this as a FRQ, for example, you might list things like air and water pollution, probably the biggest, most famous one that we'll hear about. But you could also talk about things like industrial resource needs, the use of low-quality fuels, both the low-quality gasoline, but also a lot of low-quality dirty coal, as they call it, excessive use of noxious and toxic chemicals, the mass dislocation of citizens, the building of dams, Three Gorges Dam, biggest dam in the world, and also the new major project of moving an entire river, the equivalent of like several hundred miles, as well as simply the Chinese government's intense focus on growth at the expense sometimes of the environment. Here's a quick video. Let's watch this.
Breathe the air for too long in the village of Tao, it may make you ill, and it may even end up killing you.
One of the things you notice here is that there is almost no wind in this village. And that means that the pollution from the nearby mines and factories simply rises into the air and then it stays put. A lot of people live on houses along lanes like this one. And as you can see, there are almost no plants and no flowers. People here say that it's very difficult to grow anything with all the pollution.
On my first night here, I joined the men of the Wandamung family for dinner. They try to wash away the taste of pollution with some weak soup. They tell me they've been abandoned. Their own village leaders left long ago in search of better air. No one cares about us, says Zhang Xianjing. Our leaders live in the city where it's cleaner, but we don't have any money, so we have to stay here. The next morning, the sky settles into a kind of orange haze. We're told this is what a good day looks like in Tou. The villagers take us to see someone suffering from the bad air. Zhang Mingjie has lung disease. He can barely move. He has to be spoon-fed by his wife. The air is so bad, she says. On winter days like this, he can't go out, he gets worse, and he just can't breathe. Before dawn, on our third day here, we wait outside the village school for classes to begin. It's minus 10 degrees, and the sky is full of smog. The pupils get straight into their lesson as noisily as they can. No one here has a clean face. In this village, you get grubby, and you stay grubby. Outside the classroom, the school's slide is too filthy to use. And above the playground, you can see the red flag of China, covered in grime. James Reynolds, BBC News, Tou.
So you get the idea of the extreme kind of reaches of some of this poverty, not poverty, but pollution. And we'll look at some more of that in just a minute. But the next question I want to ask you to think about is who influences Chinese government policies? Who has the power in China specifically, not necessarily the person's name, but the positions of power that would actually make policies that could affect this kind of pollution? Who are the policymakers in China? What kind of answers could you give? Communist Party would be a good place to start because that's, as we've talked about, the idea of the party state. It's where the true power is. You could talk about the Politburo or the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the Communist Party as being the real power. But as we've also learned throughout the unit on China, that NGOs and interest groups are playing more and more of a real role in terms of helping influence environmental policy in China. And also international groups, the United Nations, World Trade Organization, and other groups. I didn't put it on the screen here, but the U.S. Embassy has played a unique role in pollution issues And I've read an article that a lot of Chinese will say that the first place they check to read the pollution indexes are in the U.S. Embassy's website, because the government website understates it every time. So what's been going on? What have they been doing? You could argue, where it says describe in your notes, that the party and the Politburo and the Standing Committee, they make their decisions about environmental policies without any real transparency, without any real openness. People don't really know what goes into that, except for it's the group of individuals making those choices. If we were talking about the NGOs, we might talk about how they've had some limited effect and they've been able to do some work. There's been a lot of protests, and there's been some movement towards certainly a greater recognition of environmental issues. And you could also talk about the effectiveness of the United Nations or the WTO trying to enforce standards. In terms of true effectiveness, you can see I've started this slide off with the first answer, which is they have not done a great job with air pollution. Let's just look at some of the images. I've just done a little internet search here and found some city scenes. This is on a highly polluted, medium polluted day and a non-polluted day. This one is really depressing to see the two. You can't even see the buildings there. This is just some information about bad air. The one on the right there shows you the U.S. Embassy Air Quality Index. And those dots, this was on January 13th, 14th, when they were way up, even above the level of 500 hazardous, where it's so dangerous that you're at high risk for getting things like lung disease and so on and so forth. Avoid outdoor exercise. Avoid any prolonged time outside. And you can see how high it is. The other map just sort of shows you extreme pollution moving between Japan and China. Of course, air pollution isn't the only problem. Water pollution is the other. You can see the garbage pickers here on this river. But there are all kinds of heavy metals and ammonium nitrogen and nitrogens and phosphates, and it is a mess, just a mess. I find some of these pictures to be just unbelievably shocking. Although remember what our Great Lakes looked like here in the United States. In the 1970s, they used to call Cleveland the mistake on the lake, and Lake Erie actually was so full of garbage and pollution that it caught on fire. The lake itself was burning for like a week before they could put it out. China is where we were in the 70s, maybe worse, and hopefully they're going to be making decisions that are going to turn it around. What else can we say about effectiveness? When we look at air pollution, the Chinese government did show its ability to pull off something like the Olympics. They managed to get air pollution way down, but it was at great cost, shutting down a lot of factories. They also, the big issue, of course, is this problem of sustained record growth of China and using cheap, low-quality fossil fuels. There's no doubt that this is nothing but trouble. And the Chinese government has recognized the need for environmental improvements, but it has not been doing it nearly as quickly as it needs to. Let's move to the other topic that we didn't cover, and that is Unit 4, Part 5, Political Culture and Participation. Quick review. What is political culture? What do we mean when we say political culture? It's basically, the simple definition is what people believe and feel about government and governing. A little slightly fancier definition would be something like this longer one here: the set of widely shared beliefs and values and norms about the way political life is carried out. It goes on to talk about the relationship of citizens to government, citizens to each other, and citizens to the economy. And one of the key phrases we talked about, like with Russia, was the persistence of political culture, how hard it is to really change, even when they went from the Tsar to communism and then to Putin. Certain things, relations between the people and the state, have stayed really actually quite similar. So, and then speaking just terms, you might add this here on your notes. The two main kinds of political culture in the world are considered to be conflictual or consensual. So conflictual is political culture where different groups clash. They've got opposing values and opposing beliefs. Consensual is on the other side, where there's less conflict, that there's a focus on shared political values. What would you say the U.S. is? You might, if you followed the news, you might be feeling like, well, we must be conflictual because we're always clashing. And yeah, we do have these huge political debates and our government shuts down and things like that. But really, America would fall into the category of consensual political culture because our shared values tend to be more significant than our clashing values. The key there to figuring this out is how much challenge is there to the legitimacy of the regime. When left-wing Democrats and right-wing Republicans complain and fight and argue, very few of them are saying we should actually just abolish the executive branch, or we should abolish the legislative branch. Even when people are mad at and Congress has approval ratings of 11%, you still don't hear like this cry for abolish the legislature, right? Because we're not a conflictual political culture. We are a consensual. The greatest example that we'll do in this class of conflictual is when we get to Nigeria and we look at North versus South and just how profoundly different they are. I suppose you could argue that we were conflictual up until the Civil War. That's a possibility. But anyways, moving on. Let's go to China. Chinese political culture. Some political scientists talk about three overlapping political cultures. Traditional political culture in China, that goes back 2,000 years. What they call the nationalism or the nationalistic Chinese political culture that goes back 100, 150 years. And then we have Maoism and communism as a big part of Chinese political culture. Yes, Mao, of course. So in your notes, the first thing it talks about is Mao's greatest failure. And I would argue, along with a lot of other political scientists, that Mao's greatest failure probably came from this attitude that he had, where he was fond of saying that the Chinese people were first of all poor and secondly blank. Poor, yes, but were they blank? In that he had this idea that he would just be able to implement this entirely new way of thinking, this new system, right? And it would not be without a lot of work. And what we're going to find out from Mao's mistakes is that nobody's blank, and that changing political culture is, of course, much harder than anyone might think. Of course, the Mao period is going to emphasize things like mass movements and the idea of continual revolution. These are all Mao posters or the Mao celebration dance down below there, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. But let's talk a little bit about, letter B in your notes, Chinese political culture. In general, there is very little sense of involvement. China is famous for conflict avoidance, respect towards leaders, a strong sense of group loyalty. Let's look at that Maoism, or the values of the Chinese Communist Party, right? They were really focused on this idea of collectivism, this shift of group loyalty, trying to make the group more important than even the family. And there's, definitely some success there, but of course, as we are seeing in the reforms today, the Chinese are very quick to go back to where they were before. Just like when we get rid of strict communism and they allow an opening up of capitalism, look how successful it is. It's like the Chinese, somebody once argued that Mao was crazy to think that they shouldn't have their own independent markets, because the marketplaces before Mao were these incredible just dens of madness and chaos that worked, though, that functioned and grew, and now we're kind of back to that. Struggle and activism. Mao believed in the continual revolution, that you had to keep things revolutionary all the time, or that it would sag, right, and get people participating in this way. He talked about egalitarianism and populism. Your favorite expression, women hold up half the sky. I think some of you read that book in your freshman year. But this was this idea that he wanted to bring true equality, class equality, but also gender equality. And he also talks about self-reliance, right? So how do you implement this stuff? How do you make these things happen? Well, it's the mass campaign. It's the political study sessions. It's the continual revolutions. And then another topic related to political culture is political participation. And of course, we're talking about things like voting or getting involved in political parties and so on and so forth. In China, there's really two kinds of participation that we can talk about. Top-down, we'll start with, and that's the idea that the party at the top determines what people can do and who they can vote for. Only really 10% of the people belong to the party, still makes it the biggest party in the world. But the party's the route to power, and power comes from the top down. But now we're seeing some bottom-up movement, right? And the bottom-up movement is this idea of the real rural elections. About 66% of rural populations are now getting involved and participating in this. And it's going to have changes in China that we don't even really know what they're going to be or what they're going to mean. This is a chart that looks at the, talking about gender equality that I mentioned a minute ago. The red line is female participation in the Communist Party. The green line is female participation in the U.S. Congress. And it's from the 1970s to 2013. And you can see that, in fact, after the time of Mao, what has China done? But it's decreased. The number of women involved has gone down. It's gone a little bit back up again. But in fact, in the U.S., we've seen great improvements. Although if you look, we're still only at 18% participation, which is pretty low. Another topic altogether is political recruitment. And this is the idea of, oh, well, this isn't actually political recruitment, but it's just a great cartoon of Putin and how he sees himself in the mirror. Let's move on. Political recruitment is the idea of how citizens are selected to be involved in politics. And in China, it's the party, of course, that does the recruitment. They're the main mechanism of recruitment, the party, the CCP. And there are two levels of recruitment. You have to recruit your power elite. Who are these guys who are going to be president or prime minister or the standing committee, right? But then you also have the recruitment at the grassroots throughout the country. How do you get people into the party, into party membership? This chart here shows you what percentage of the nation has a high school degree and what percentage of the party has a high school degree. And so you see very slow growth in the nation, and you see very rapid growth, right, in the party. And this is a really big change. Look at the current membership 6 or 7 years ago of the Chinese Communist Party. It's now closer to 100, 110 million. But one of the largest groups there was the 35 or younger, almost a quarter of the party becoming younger and younger members. The importance of education to the party has become really big. In the early years of the Communist Party, it didn't matter if you were educated. It started to get important in the 50s and early 60s, right? But then as soon as you hit the Cultural Revolution, being educated is actually a problem. You don't want to be educated. Educated, re-educated means going to get the real education and going back into the farms. And it won't be till the 80s that we start to move back towards putting a focus on education. All right, so again, looking at new recruits. In the year 2005 alone, 80% of the new people joining were under the age of 35. 85% were educated. And this is pretty huge. And so they call China's leaders today the technocrats because they are a more highly educated group, and there's a belief that this kind of pragmatic problem solving is going to be really beneficial for China's future. So where do the cadres come from, right? The old cadres are retiring. You have the Cultural Revolution, which makes a big shift. And now we're talking about, and again, these are the 1980 reforms. Look at percent college educated. That's on the right. And you can see that goes from 38 to 52. The average age of the party goes from 64 to 58. So we're seeing some pretty significant changes, right? And finally, I'm just going to show you this chart of recruitment at the grassroots. Party recruits the kinds of people that are being recruited. And over time, you see that it's peasants and workers, workers and students. And then finally, in the 80s until now, we're talking about professionals and educated youth. A major shift. And this is going to mean a lot of big change for China in the years to come. Finally, just looking at party membership and how it's grown and grown and grown. One last topic I want to talk about that was also in those part 6 notes is the role of China in Africa and the boom of China as a trade partner, China for development aid, China for assistance. This one shows you the amazing growth of Chinese trade. It makes their 139% increase to Europe look tiny. 400% increase to America seems great. But look at the Asian increase, more than 2,000% trade increase. A few other really interesting charts that just show you the booming trade between China and Africa and how it's gone from almost nothing in the early 2000s to just being their #1 trading partner. China has become literally the #1 trading partner of Africa, and it's a big deal, and it changes politics for Africa. It's also important for what we understand about China. When we look at this chart, it shows you where China is investing. And you will notice that their highest one is the Western Hemisphere, as not one country. U.S. is the highest country, but as a region, Western Hemisphere is 61, I believe this is millions of dollars, billions of dollars. Millions, that wouldn't be much. Africa is #2. Africa is actually #3 because West Asia is 45. So the third region, before Europe, before North America, even before East Asia, Africa is major part of Chinese trade, right? There are concerns, this is a new form of conquering and colonizing Africa. What does this mean? What a lot of African leaders like is that the Chinese government doesn't insist on any kind of conditionality. They're willing to trade and do development aids and give lots of money without any kind of strings or anything like that. I'm going to actually not play the video. I'm going to leave it at that. And thank you very much for listening, and good luck studying for your final exam. Bye.